Hi, I'm Tiegan, a deception and autism researcher at Lancaster University. I'm here today with Dan, a contestant on the latest series of The Traitors, to talk all things autism, deception and the Traitors. Before we start though, Dan, would you mind quickly explaining to people who are uninitiated what The Traitors is about?
So The Traitors is a strategy and deception game show which airs on BBC One. I've just taken part in its third season. And the concept of the game is that at the very start, a number of players are picked as traitors, and they have to secretly murder the different contestants each night, not literally, and avoid suspicion and avoid people thinking that they themselves are the traitors. And then each day there's a vote out, and people vote for who they think the traitors are. If the traitors get to the end of the game with faithfuls, then the traitors win the grand prize pot. But if the faithfuls are able to get rid of all the traitors by the end, the faithfuls win the game.
So I'm ready to dive right in. I think you have some questions about my research to begin.
I do. So Tiegan, can you tell me about your research and how it connects to this season of The Traitors?
Yeah, I can. So my research is I'm looking at the deceptive communication in autistic adults, and I'm following the entire process from when autistic adults choose to lie and how often they do so, how they behave when they lie compared to when they tell the truth, and how they perceive other people and their behaviour and how this integrates into their deception decision making. It relates really closely to this season, especially because you're a contestant on there, because the show is all about how people perceive each other and how they look at people's behaviour and language to try and indicate whether or not they think that they're lying. So I always enjoy watching the show to see how people verbalise their decisions and to see whether it connects with any theories that I work with or whether they're following a completely down the wrong path. And especially watching this season with you, I was really interested to see how sort of my research may play out in a real world, because I love researching and I love doing it here in the lab. But the main aim is to have real life implications. And so it was really interesting to see you engage with the other contestants.
Fantastic. It sounds so interesting. And when I first saw it online, I was like, wow, this is absolutely needed. You know, it's something that I've thought of myself as well. So I guess for you, why does studying deception and autism matter, and what are some of those real world implications?
I think it's really important that we further our understanding of autism and deception for a myriad of reasons. One of the first ones is that stereotypically people believe that when people are lying, they'll avert their eye gaze or they may start to fidget. These are all common characteristics and natural behaviours that are present in some autistic adults. And as such, we see that some autistic adults may be misjudged and viewed to be deceptive, even when they're telling the truth, just because of the natural behaviours that they display. And this can have serious complications in the criminal justice system. For example, a defendant on trial, if they're autistic and they're displaying certain behaviours, will this influence the jury to potentially sway them to a guilty verdict or think that the person is lying? In relation to autistic adults engaging in deception themselves, although growing up we're often taught lying's wrong, lying is also a fact of life that we can't get by without, and people are encouraged to engage in pro-social deception. So, yes, I love your new outfit. No, I really hate it, but I'm not going to tell you that. And we want to see whether if autistic adults can't engage or don't want to engage in this type of deception, does that influence the social connections that they form?
Okay. And when you think about it, there are so many examples of that parasocial lying that happen just every day.
Yeah.
Just completely accepted.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how recognised is this issue? So, for example, is there any anti-bias training that exists or forewarning given to different institutions to kind of prevent people being misjudged?
So, fortunately, it is becoming a more well-recognised issue, especially in the criminal justice system. But to me, it still has a very long way to go. So it is supposed to be mandatory for all police forces to receive equality and diversity training. The implementation of them across forces definitely varies across the UK, but so does the focus that they have on autism specifically. So, for example, some forces may get whole training sessions on equality and diversity with a 10-minute section on autism. And it's just not enough. And we know that in a study conducted by Crane et al. In 2016, of around 350 police officers in England and Wales, only 42% of that sample were satisfied with how they engaged with autistic adults. And even more concerningly, over 60% admitted that they had not received any autism training as a serving police officer. So we definitely need more training to go into the police side. In relation to the court system, it is dependent upon disclosure. So if the defendant, witness or victim is autistic and discloses this to the court, that information can be made available and can be used as part of the defence. However, there is no routine or mandatory training for jurors on understanding autism. So again, they may be told that a defendant is autistic, but it's dependent upon their level of knowledge, which just isn't good enough in a court of law. And to me, that isn't a fair way to perceive or judge people when you don't understand. The judge can and should inform the jury of how to sort of interact with this knowledge. So if they need to take into account their diagnosis when coming to their verdict, the judge can say this. But again, that's dependent on the judge understanding autism themselves. So unfortunately, I think we still do have a long way to go, but I'm hoping that with research that I'm conducting and a few other people who are starting to research in this space, we can start to create educational programs for the legal system.
Yeah, and it absolutely sounds like it's completely needed. And because it's so difficult as well, you talked about disclosure, there's a lot of autistic people out there who haven't yet received their diagnosis or who might not even realise that they are autistic. So they're going to face up against barriers if they themselves aren't able to explain why they might be acting differently to somebody else. It's really hard. Just wanted to ask, how good are autistic people at identifying when others are lying to them?
So that's a really interesting question. And there is currently very, very, very little research out there into this. So at the moment, we can only actually theorise and hypothesise about what we think. I am currently running a study, so come back to me in a year and I might be able to give you some data. But, for example, we're hypothesising that autistic adults may not be as good at detecting when they're being lied to as non-autistic adults due to some underlying psychological mechanisms. So, for example, executive functioning is often believed to be needed when we're deciding whether or not someone's lying to us. So we need our working memory to be able to integrate information in a chronological order and to be able to plan and be flexible with our thoughts. And some autistic adults experience difficulties with executive functioning, which may make their ability to integrate all that information cohesively. They may have a reduced ability to do so, which may make them poorer at detecting when they're being lied to. And with social experience, if some autistic adults prefer not to engage in social interactions as often as non-autistic adults, they may just have less experience with being lied to or in situations when people lie. And a lot of how we understand communication comes from looking at other people, experiencing it. So it may be an element of that too.
That makes a lot of sense because I have less experience of socialising with other people as a choice in my life. And so that probably explains why I wasn't great at finding traitors in your day.
Do you usually find it difficult to tell when people are lying, or do you think you're pretty good at it outside of the game?
I always thought I was quite good at telling when people were lying to me, but to be honest, I don't really come up against that many examples of it in my day-to-day life because I have quite a small circle of friends and family, and I'd like to, I trust them all, and they're not constantly lying to me.
So it's a good thing, isn't it? Then?
Yeah. I don't think I'm living in some Truman Show reality where no one's telling me the truth. So yeah, I always thought that I was good, but Traitors does force you into a situation where you're mixed with lots of people that you wouldn't ordinarily mix with. So it can be quite confused at times to really know people's true intentions, especially if you've got no background on them and you've only known them for a couple of days.
Yeah.
I'd like to know whether you think that the lies that autistic people tell generally differ from those that non-autistic people might tell.
So I actually do have data on this, but I can share. So we ran a study in which we asked autistic and non-autistic adults to tell me how often they lied in general and how they felt about telling lies in general. For example, did they feel guilty or did they think they were going to be believed? We then asked them to tell me whether or not they would lie in a set of certain situations. So we gave them 12 situations that each related to a different type of lie. So we had lies for the self, so lying to protect or benefit oneself, lying for another person, which is lying to protect or benefit one other person, for example, your friend or a family member. And then we had group lies, which are called Pareto lies. And these are lies that are told to protect or benefit the group of which you are a part of, so your friendship group or your family as a whole, including yourself. We found that autistic and non-autistic adults told similar amounts of self-oriented and other-oriented lies, but they did tell significantly less group-oriented lies. The reason we think this may be is because of that social experience element that I was talking about earlier. Autistic adults may have less time spent in interactions in social groups, which is when this type of lie occurs most frequently. So that with this reduced experience, they may not be as comfortable telling these types of lies. But what about you? Does that reflect in your everyday life, or do you think you tell?
I think that makes sense, because one thing that I found with myself and through speaking with other autistic people is that we tend to be quite resistant to groupthink as well a lot of the time. So it doesn't surprise me that the lies that autistic people might tell to benefit a group as a whole will be significantly fewer than for like the self, I guess. One lie, for example, in the game that I was vehemently opposed to saying was that we're all here for each other and we're all here to benefit each other as a group. I was like, no, we're all here for ourselves. Let's not waste time and lie about this. So from personal experience, that probably does reflect my own experience, and like you say, the lessened social experience and not wanting to be a part of social groups as much as non-autistic people might contribute to that too. So I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know whether autistic people tend to behave differently when telling lies compared to other non-autistic people.
So we're currently analysing data from a study in which we asked non-autistic and autistic adults to tell a lie and to tell the truth about what they did last weekend. We're currently actually in the room where I conducted the study, so we're using the camera setup that I had, and we recorded their eye gaze, the self-manipulators, which are things like playing with your hair or your jewellery to calm yourself down, and iconic illustrators, which are hand movements that supplement speech. So if I said, I went left, that would be an iconic illustrator. We also focused on paraverbal deception cues, so response latency, how quickly did people respond to questions, and response length. We hypothesized that due to like the stereotypical beliefs about deception, we may see some different patterns in eye gaze data, and because we know eye gaze is influenced by autism. So I stress that the findings are preliminary, but we have found some interesting eye gaze data. So we found that autistic adults engage in significantly less direct eye contact across both honest and deceptive videos in comparison to non-autistic adults. What we don't see is that this trend continues into being able to predict whether someone's lying or not. So, for example, in the non-autistic adults, they engage in frequently more direct eye contact during the lying conditions because we think they're trying to counteract this stereotypical belief. They think, okay, if people think liars avert their gaze, I'm going to make more direct eye contact so they believe me. Autistic adults showed a little bit more direct eye contact in the deceptive videos in comparison to the honest ones, but this wasn't a significant difference. When we take this further, we actually looked at, okay, we're seeing some indication that eye gaze is predicting whether someone's lying or not. But we know from the literature that deception cues are often exaggerated, so we wanted to double check that what we were finding was a true effect. So we ran some additional analysis, and we actually found that eye gaze, although in the analysis is a significant predictor of veracity, when you tease this out further, the effect is not very strong. It's actually a stronger predictor of population status. And we think this is really important for like the criminal justice system when we want to tell people, if you're looking at eye gaze as an indicator of deceit, please don't be doing this, because actually what you may be seeing is as an indicator of population status instead. So it's really important before any sort of police interview or legal system process happens to identify whether the person that you're speaking with is autistic or non-autistic.
Okay, and I'm curious, what do we mean by population status?
So that means whether or not someone identifies as autistic or non-autistic.
That makes sense. Great. I'm curious to understand whether your understanding of deception and autism affected how you viewed this season of The Traitors. And as a deception researcher, will you look out for anything specifically?
Yeah. So I always loved watching the Traitors, especially because of what I do. It feels like I can class it as work. It's like get to watch people lie and interact with one another. But I think it definitely did influence how I watched this season, especially the way you decided to play the game, or whether it was a choice or not, but how you played the game. I think because of my understanding of autism, I felt like I could see the thought processes that you were going down. You're correct in saying it is a self-interested game, even though people, do say it's this big group thing. It is to an extent, but if you want to get to the end, you have to look out for yourself. And everyone knows that going in. So you were just playing it down the line, like you said, and I found that really interesting that at the start, the other players seemed to be okay with this, but then it got to a point when they just couldn't seem to understand your gameplay anymore. And I think maybe my knowledge of autism, and as an outside viewer, I could sort of understand where you were coming from a little bit more than them. Did you think that there was some miscommunications with the way you decided to play the game and how they viewed it?
I think sometimes my approach wasn't always palatable to the other players in the game, because I was very direct about the fact that this is a game and I am going to play it really strategically and competitively, and I'm not going to apologise for that. But I think that that's not something that your fellow players always want to be when they themselves are trying to protect themselves in a game like this. And I think probably in the UK as well, strategy in different types of game shows has always been something that's undercover. It's not really spoken about too brazenly as much as I was doing. That there is the attempt to kind of sugarcoat everything with a team mentality, which obviously logically doesn't make sense. Not everybody in the game can win, but I think probably at times people did find it quite uncomfortable that I was being so blunt about my motivations for being there.
Yeah, me and my supervisor actually had a chat about what you've just said, in that we thought maybe they were struggling to understand or get on board with your gameplay because it was almost holding up a mirror to them. They were doing exactly the same thing you were. They were acting in a self-interested manner in the missions, but they just weren't openly saying it. But with you openly saying it, they couldn't hide from it. So we were interested to think maybe it was a little bit about that going on as well.
Yeah, I never wanted to come across as hypocritical in the game. I wanted to always defend a position of, I am playing the game, I am playing it a certain way. If you don't like it, fair enough. And if other people were to behave selfishly in a game as well, I wouldn't judge that. I'd be like, yeah, that absolutely makes sense. I completely understand your logical reasoning for doing that. So I think for me, it meant that I didn't really ever take things too personally in the game because I understood a selfish motivation quite well.
Okay, so thank you, Dan, for asking about my research. I really appreciate the chance to have a chat about that. But now I'm going to ask probably what I think everyone is waiting for about your experience on the Traitors. So to begin, I'd like to ask whether there are any times on the show when you struggled to tell when the other players were being truthful.
It's really interesting because I went into it thinking that everybody was going to play a completely cutthroat, self-interested game, regardless of whether they were a faithful or a traitor. So I didn't trust anybody from day one. And anytime anybody was nice to me or behaved in a way that I didn't think lined up with the selfish nature of the game, I found that very suspicious. So in episode 1, people were being nice to me, coming over to me and making sure I was okay. And I was like, that's a bit weird. I don't understand why that person's doing that, because in my mind, everyone had exactly the same sort of self-interested, ruthless instincts. So I think at times I found it confusing to really decipher people's motivations, because I would always trust somebody who would have a really intense strategy conversation with me and display their own ruthlessness over somebody who I thought was being nice. And that person could have just been being nice in the moment. Yeah. But for me, what made more sense was somebody behaving selfishly. So, for example, if somebody else displayed a selfish trait in a mission, I'd be like, they're trustworthy because I can understand why they're doing that. Whereas if somebody was overly nice to me, I was like, I don't quite understand that. So maybe that's...
That's such an interesting take. You're selfish, I trust you. Outside of the game, that probably wouldn't be the case, but it does make sense in that context.
Yeah, all strategic. So Mina and I had a lot of strategic conversations quite early on. And so that built quite a bit of trust with her, because I thought I can talk game with her. There are too many barriers up in our conversations with each other. So for a lot of the early part of the game, I did really trust Mina because we were able to have that unfiltered communication.
I'm going to add in an extra question, I think, here. At what point, because you just talked about Nina, at what point did you start to suspect that, or did you ever suspect that she was a traitor?
I came into the game thinking the traitors are probably going to follow a somewhat similar pattern of how they were selected in seasons 1 and 2, because in both seasons it was very gregarious people, extroverted people who were chosen as traitors. And I thought, well, that's probably going to play out in our season 2, because you want to have people who can integrate really well into a group setting. So anybody who was a bit quieter, a bit more introverted, I ruled out straight away. And Mina was always fantastic socially, so she was always in my shortlist of people who could be a traitor. And I did trust her as a player because we have that same kind of strategic approach. And it also benefits you as a faithful to be aligned with the traitors too, because then they can protect you. But in those last couple of days when I started to make a lot of really incorrect calls about who I thought the traitors were, I started to get in my head quite a bit, and I thought, I'm only being kept in this game because I'm making really stupid reads, and probably because I'm close to a traitor. And I was very close to Mina all the way through, and I also thought she had the capability of being a traitor. So by the time I left, I think I even said in my own cloaked, I think Mina was probably a traitor.
So in the show, we see you share that you were autistic with the audience.
Yeah.
But we never see you disclose this to the other players on the show. I was just interested to know whether you shared this information with them, and if you did, how was it received, or did you think it influenced how the other players perceived you?
It was really interesting because I think I didn't realise this until the show, but I'm quite an intense starer at people when I'm talking to them, and I don't even realise that I'm doing it, but I think it probably comes back to not making eye contact enough in the past and trying to overcompensate for that. And I was doing that in the first few days of the game, and it was actually picked up on by a couple of people, not necessarily to say we don't trust you, but just as an observation. So I was thinking at the time, I don't want people to think I'm a traitor because I'm like glaring at them. So I did say quite openly to a lot of players, I am autistic, I might be overcompensating. Please don't judge me on that. It's good feedback for life, but it's a crap reason to get rid of somebody being the traitors. And people were very receptive to that. There were other players who had autistic family members and friends, and they were like, okay, yes, that makes sense. We can relate to that story. So I think it was great for me because being able to be honest about it so early on in the game, I think allowed me to unmask and allowed me to play the game the way that I wanted to. Because from that point onwards, I was like, it's a self-interested game. I'm gonna act how I want, and I'm just gonna be myself. And that was really liberating because I've not always been able to act like that in the past.
Yeah. Have you engaged in masking them throughout your life, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think prior to my diagnosis, I was masking without even realising that I was doing it. Because I realised before the diagnosis, I'm not acting the same socially as everybody else. So that gave me a lot of anxiety, and it meant that I was trying to overcorrect all of the time. And then again, as soon as I got my diagnosis, I was like, I am as free to be as weird as I want to be now. There's an explanation for why I don't always see things the same way as other people, and I'm not going to feel shame for that anymore.
As you shouldn't. So on the show, you were very open about how your way of playing was different to the other players. How do you feel being autistic influenced your gameplay, if it did?
I think it bled into my gameplay so much because one of my key autistic traits is having incredibly intense hyper-focus areas, and I've always been massively passionate about strategy and reality TV game shows. So because of that hyper-intense interest, I was able to bring a lot of that experience into the game, and that dictated a lot of how I played the game. But I also think I was able to separate between emotion and game quite easily, because I tend to see things as very linear, compartmentalized experiences, and I thought this is a game where we don't really know each other and anything is okay to do, more or less. So I never really kind of felt myself taking things too personally in the game or feeling too emotional about things. I was always able to separate between them quite easily. And I think my communication style as well was quite influenced by my autism. I was very straight talking and blunt and direct at times, which made players feel uncomfortable at times. But I was also really proud at how I kind of laid things out because it was authentic, and I feel like it was very honest a lot of the time.
Yeah, it was very refreshing to see someone go on the show and actually say what they mean. It's sort of hiding behind ifs and buts. Like, you were very direct, and it did come across. Yeah,
no, that's great. And a lot of my friends said that you were absolutely you to a T on the show because you didn't sugarcoat a single thing. Like, yeah, that sounds like me.
And I mean, if you have such an interest in reality TV, was it like an incredible experience to be able to go on the show?
It was a dream come true, and it just gave me an opportunity to kind of just play the way that I wanted to play. And I didn't always think that I would have that opportunity, but the time that I was in the game, I played it completely authentically, and that was very validating.
So I'm really interested to hear about this. So after one of the missions on the show, we see you have quite a tense discussion with a fellow player. who was a bit upset that nobody else had sacrificed themselves in a mission because he had. When we see you on the show talking about the situation, we see you say to him, "We didn't have a conversation about doing that." And he responds with, "Because I didn't think it needed to be said."
Yeah.
Now, as an autism researcher, I found this really interesting in terms of the non-autistic social expectations that a lot of people have when communicating. So there's an emphasis on understanding what hasn't been said, or trying to make an inference about what other people are thinking or feeling. I was interested to hear your thoughts on that, and whether you've experienced a similar situation maybe outside of the game in which someone expected you just to understand what they'd said or were feeling, but they hadn't actually communicated that to you directly.
I think that mission was ironically one of my favourites, but I think that moment was very interesting for me because I was very open about my strategy from the very start of that boat mission. I said quite openly to everybody, I'm not getting off this boat. Everybody can do what they want, but I'm staying on. So I was very consistent and clear all the way through. And I felt like everybody had the right to make their own decision. A couple of people got off the boat later on, and I actually said to them, it's your decision if you would like to do that. But I thought I would always prioritise safety. So for me, it would be worthwhile getting to the end without any money in that mission if it meant that I could be safe. So I was quite surprised in the altercation afterwards, because I feel like I'd been consistent and clear, and I tried to logically explain why I'd done what I did. But I can understand, and I saw this interpretation online, that maybe it lacked a little bit of empathy and social awareness, because somebody was obviously frustrated in that moment for sacrificing themselves, and I responded to it in a very sort of direct, blunt way. So I can, but it was an interesting scenario, and I think this also came up later in the game, that point about unspoken cues, because after I'd marked Mina, I think she was genuinely very, very upset. She was upset that her friend had betrayed her, and also because the gunk had gone in her hair. There was a situation where we were in a group afterwards in the bar, and she just said, "I just wish the person could tell me." And to a lot of people, that might have been an unspoken social cue that she wanted her friend to reach out and be honest with her. But it was, to me, not as clear as probably I would have needed in that moment. And because it wasn't directly asked of me, I just didn't do it. I didn't say to her, "Look, it was me and I'm sorry," because I saw everything as being part of this compartmentalized game. So I didn't read the social cue and the desire that Mina had for her friend to confide in her. And then outside of the game as well, I've had a couple of situations where a friend has said something that they're really proud of, or that they think is a really emotional moment, and I've responded to it in quite a blunt way, and they found that a bit upsetting. And then all of a sudden I've looked and faced them, and they're in tears. I'm like, "Oh my God, what's wrong? What's happened?" And they've said, "You've just upset me with what you've said." And I was like, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I never meant to. I didn't mean to," because my intention, and it was never ever to upset anybody in the game. Mm-hmm. But sometimes I can be quite direct, and I think people find that challenging at times.
Yeah. You made a point in one of the round tables, I think it might have been the last one, about how everyone was acting in a self-interested way. But you were the only one that was open about this, as you were throughout the entirety of the show. How do you think your openness around this contributed to your banishment?
So I think my openness about my self-interested strategy did contribute to my banishment, because I don't think that people could process the way that I was playing the game. In my final roundtable, I think people are looking for anything that they can to indicate that traits of behaviour, and so any kind of divergence from what's expected can be seen as evidence that somebody might be a traitor. So somebody being so self-interested and making self-interested move time and time again might have given them pause and thought, well, why is he behaving like this? He's not acting like he's part of the team. And to be honest, I probably wasn't. I probably was the worst faithful in history when it came to being part of a team. But there are logical reasons to explain why somebody is a faithful, though. Mm-hmm. Desperately trying to get a shield to protect themselves, or desperately staying on a boat so that they're not eligible for murder that night. Logically, it makes sense that I was a faithful and I was desperately trying to stay in the game. But because it was so antithetical to the strategy of other people and a team mentality, I think it did lead to my downfall.
So reflecting on your time on the show then, are there any instances in which you think you should have maybe lied or handled the situation differently?
So reflecting back on my time on the show, there are a lot of things that I probably would have done differently. But I'm not sure that my communication approach or my honesty is something that I necessarily would have done. And you know, I think a lot of people online have said he said the quiet part out loud, which contributed to his downfall. But I was really proud at how kind of blunt and honest I was throughout the game, because I think that also resonated with a lot of people as well, who saw themselves in kind of what I was saying. So yeah, I've got things that I definitely would have done differently in the game, but I think my communication style I'm okay with.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe in other seasons in other countries there may have been, but as I'm aware, we haven't had an autistic player on the game, or at least disclosed on the game. So I think you're right in saying, like, being so open and like so authentically yourself would have been a great role model to the autistic people across the country. Thank you. My final question to you is, what did you learn about yourself during your time on the show?
So I learned quite a lot about myself during the show. I think because I was so passionate about the game, I went sort of full steam ahead, or, you know, guns blazing those first couple of episodes, and I tried to do as much as I possibly could. You know, I was active in the missions. I tried to have as many strategic conversations with contestants as possible, and by the time I left, I felt quite burnt out, and I was like, oh my god, you know, I've been playing this game at a really high level for the time that I've been in, and I think that's applicable to my life as well. I try and do everything all the time. I've got a bit of FOMO. I don't want to miss out on any opportunity, but I think just pacing myself a little bit more and just picking the things that I should get invested in, and it doesn't need to be everything. I think also, and I don't know how viable it is for me to change this about myself, but I certainly lacked adaptability and flexibility in the game at times as well, and I wasn't always open to different interpretations of things. So just having a bit of space to think about things in a different kind of a way and adapting my behaviour at times, I think is something that would benefit me in future. My final question for you, Tiegan, is: would you ever go on the show, and why?
That is a hard question. I think if I did go on the show, I would definitely lie about the fact that I'm doing a PhD in lie detection. I'd either get murdered or banished straight away.
Yeah.
I would really, in theory, I would love to go on the show. Seeing sort of what I do in the lab in real life would be fantastic. However, I think I'd be really bad at it. Lie detection researchers are actually just as bad as everyone else at telling when people are being lied to or were being lied to. So I would love to go on the show, but I would love to be like part of the production team and just sit in and watch this all happen. So yeah, maybe not answer, but that's what I'd do.
I'll take it.
So that is all our questions. Thank you so much for joining me, Dan. Thank you. And thank you to Lancaster University for hosting the interview, and Autistica for partnering on my study and connecting me with Dan so I could interview you today.
Great stuff. Thanks, Tiegan.